Good night, Governor. Hello, cried the voice. Have you got a good one? I think so, replied my owner. I wish you luck with him. Thank ye, Governor. And he rode on. We turned up one of the side streets, and about halfway up that we turned into a very narrow street, with rather poor-looking houses on one side, and what seemed to be coach houses and stables on the other. My owner pulled up at one of the houses and whistled. The door flew open, and a young woman, followed by a little girl and boy, ran out. There was a very lively greeting as my rider dismounted. Now then, Harry, my boy, open the gates, and mother will bring us a lantern. The next minute they were all standing round me in the stable yard. Is he gentle, father? Yes, Dolly, as gentle as your own kitten. Come, and pat him. At once the little hand was patting all over my shoulder, without fear. How good it felt. Let me get him a bran mash while you rub him down, said the mother. Do, Polly. It's just what he wants. And I know you've got a beautiful mash ready for me. Sausage, dumpling, and apple turnover, shouted the boy, which set them all laughing. I was led into a comfortable, clean-smelling stall, with plenty of dry straw, and after a capital supper I lay down, thinking I was going to be very happy. My new master's name was Jeremiah Barker, but as everyone called him Jerry, I shall do the same. Polly, his wife, was just as good a match as a man could have. She was a plump, trim, tidy little woman, with smooth, dark hair, dark eyes, and a merry little mouth. The boy was nearly 12 years old, a tall, frank, good-tempered lad, and little Dorothy, Dolly they called her, was her mother over again at 8 years old. They were all wonderfully fond of each other. I never knew such a happy, merry family before or since. Jerry had a cab of his own and 2 horses, which he drove and attended to himself. His other horse was a tall, white, rather large-boned animal called Captain. He was old now, but when he was young he must have been splendid. He had still a proud way of holding his head and arching his neck. In fact, he was a high-bred, fine-mannered, noble old horse, every inch of him. He told me that in his early youth he went to the Crimean War. He belonged to an officer in the cavalry, and used to lead the regiment. I will tell you more of that later. The next morning, when I was well groomed, Polly and Dolly came into the yard to see me and make friends. Harry had been helping his father since the early morning, and had stated his opinion that I should turn out a regular brick. Polly brought me a slice of apple, and Dolly a piece of bread, and made as much of me as if I had been the black beauty of olden time. It was a great treat to be petted again, and talked to in a gentle voice, and I let them see as well as I could that I wished to be friendly. Polly thought I was very handsome, and a great deal too good for a cab, if it was not for the broken knees. Of course, there's no one to tell us whose fault that was, said Jerry, and as long as I don't know, I shall give him the benefit of the doubt. For a firmer, neater stepper, I never rode. We'll call him Jack, after the old one. Shall we, Polly? Do, she said. For I like to keep a good name going. Captain went out in the cab all morning. Harry came in after school to feed me and give me water. In the afternoon I was put in the cab. Jerry took as much pains to see if the collar and bridle fitted comfortably as if he had been John Manley over again. When the crupper was let out a hole or two, it all fitted well. There was no bearing rein, no curb, nothing but the plain ring snaffle. What a blessing that was! After driving through this side street, we came to the large cab stand where Jerry had said good night. On one side of this wide street were high houses, with a wonderful shop fronts, and on the other was an old church and churchyard surrounded by iron palisades. Alongside these iron rails a number of cabs were drawn up, waiting for passengers. Bits of hay were lying about on the ground. Some of the men were standing together talking. Some were sitting on their boxes reading the newspaper, and one or two were feeding their horses with bits of hay and a drink of water. We pulled up in the rank at the back of the last cab. 2 or 3 men came round and began to look at me and passed their remarks. Very good for a funeral," said one. "Too smart-looking," said another, shaking his head in a very wise way. "You'll find out something wrong one of these fine mornings, or my name isn't Jones." "Well," said Jerry pleasantly, "I suppose I need not find it out till it finds me out, eh? And if so, I'll keep up my spirits a little longer." Then came up a broad-faced man, dressed in a great grey coat with great grey capes and great white buttons, and a grey hat, and a blue comforter loosely tied around his neck. His hair was grey too, but he was a jolly-looking fellow, and the other men made way for him. He looked me all over as if he had been going to buy me, and then straightened himself up with a grunt. He said, "He's the right sort for you, Jerry. I don't care what you gave for him, he'll be worth it." Thus my character was established on the stand. This man's name was Grant, but he was called Grey Grant, or Governor Grant. He had been the longest on that stand of any of the men, and he took it upon himself to settle matters and stop disputes. He was generally a good-humoured, sensible man, but if his temper was a little out, as it sometimes was, when he drank too much, nobody liked to come too near his fist, for he could deal a very heavy blow. The first week of my life as a cab horse was very trying. I had never been used to London, and the noise, the hurry, the crowds of horses, carts, and carriages that I had to make my way through made me feel anxious and harassed. But I soon found that I could perfectly trust my driver, and then I made myself easy and got used to it. Jerry was a good driver, as good a driver as I'd ever known, and what was better, he took as much thought for his horses as he did for himself. He soon found out that I was willing to work and do my best, and he never laid the whip on me, unless it was gently drawing the end of it over my back when I was to go on. But generally I knew this quite well by the way in which he took up the reins, and I believe his whip was more frequently stuck up by his side than in his hand. In a short time, I and my master understood each other as well as horse and man can do. In the stable, too, he did all he could for our comfort. The stalls were old-fashioned style, too much on the slope, but he had 2 movable bars fixed across the back of our stalls, so that at night, and when we were resting, he just took off our halters and put up the bars, and thus we could turn about and stand whichever way we pleased, which was a great comfort. Jerry kept us very clean, and gave us as much change of food as he could, and always plenty of it. And not only that, but he always gave us plenty of clean, fresh water, which he allowed to stand by us both night and day, except, of course, when we came in warm. Some people say that a horse ought not to drink all he likes, but I know if we were allowed to drink what we want and when we want it, we drink only a little at a time, and it does us a great deal more good than swallowing down half a bucket full at a time, because we have been left without till we are thirsty and miserable. Some grooms will go home to their beer and leave us for hours with our dry hay and oats and nothing to moisten them. Then, of course, we gulp down too much at once, which helps to spoil our breathing and sometimes chills our stomachs. But the best thing that we had here was our Sundays for rest. We worked so hard in the week that I do not think we could have kept it up but for that day. Besides, We then had time to enjoy each other's company. On these days I learned my companion's history. Captain had been broken in and trained for an army horse. His first owner was an officer of cavalry going out to the Crimean War. He said he quite enjoyed the training with all the other horses, trotting together, turning together to the right hand and to the left, halting at the word of command and dashing forward at full speed at the sound of the trumpet or signal of the officer. He was, when young, a dark, dappled iron grey, and considered very handsome. His master, a young high-spirited gentleman, was very fond of him, and treated him from the first with the greatest care and kindness. He told me he thought the life of an army horse was very pleasant, but when it came to being sent abroad, over the sea in a great ship, he almost changed his mind. That part of it, said he, was dreadful. Of course we could not walk off the land into the ship, so they were obliged to put strong straps under our bodies, and then we were lifted off our legs in spite of our struggles, and were swung through the air over the water to the deck of the great vessel. There we were placed in small, close stalls, and never for a long time saw the sky, or were able to stretch our legs. The ship sometimes rolled about in high winds, and we were knocked about, and felt bad enough. However, at last it came to an end, and we were hauled up and swung over again to the land. We were very glad, and snorted and neighed for joy when we once more felt firm ground under our feet. We soon found that the country we had come to was very different from our own, and that we had many hardships to endure besides the fighting. But many of the men were so fond of their horses that they did everything they could to make them comfortable in spite of snow, wet, and all things out of order. But what about the fighting, said I? Was not that worse than anything else? Well, said he, I hardly know. We always liked to hear the trumpet sound and to be called out, and were impatient to start off, though sometimes we had to stand for hours waiting for the word of command. And when the word was given, we used to spring forward as gaily and eagerly as if there were no cannon balls, bayonets, or bullets. I believe, so long as we felt our rider firm in the saddle, his hand steady on the bridle, not one of us gave way to fear, not even when the terrible bombshells whirled through the air and burst into 1,000 pieces. I, with my noble master, went into many actions together without a wound, and though I saw horses shot down with bullets, pierced through with lances, and gashed with fearful sabre cuts, though we left them dead on the field or dying in the agony of their wounds, I don't think I feared for myself. My master's cheery voice, as he encouraged his men, made me feel as if he and I could not be killed. I had such perfect trust in him that while he was guiding me, I was ready to charge up to the very cannon's mouth. I saw many brave men cut down, many fall mortally wounded from their saddles. I had heard the cries and groans of the dying. I had cantered over ground slippery with blood, and frequently had to turn aside to avoid trampling on a wounded man or horse. But until one dreadful day, I had never felt terror. That day I shall never forget. Here old Captain paused for a while and drew a long breath. I waited, and he went on. It was one autumn morning, and as usual, an hour before daybreak our cavalry had turned out, ready, caparisoned for the day's work, whether it might be fighting or waiting. The men stood by their horses, waiting, ready for orders. As the light increased, there seemed to be some excitement among the officers. And before the day was well begun, we heard the firing of enemy guns. Then one of the officers rode up and gave the word for the men to mount, and in a second every man was in his saddle, and every horse stood expecting the touch of the rein or the pressure of the rider's heels, all animated, all eager. But still, we had been trained so well that except by the champing of our bits and the restive tossing of our heads from time to time, it could not be said that we stirred. My dear master and I were at the head of the line. As all sat motionless and watchful, he took a little grey, stray lock of my mane that had turned over on the wrong side, laid it over on the right side, and smoothed it down with his hand. Then, patting my neck, he said, "We shall have a day of it today, Bayard, my beauty, and we'll do our duty as we have done." He stroked my neck that morning more, I think, than he had ever done before, quietly on and on, as if he were thinking of something else. I loved to feel his hand on my neck, and arched my crest proudly and happily, but I stood very still, for I knew all his moods, and when he liked me to be quiet and when gay. I cannot tell all that happened that day, but I will tell of the last charge that we made together. It was across a valley in front of the enemy's cannon. By this time we were well used to the roar of heavy guns, the rattle of musket fire, and the flying of shot near us. But never had I been under such fire as we rode through on that day. From the right, from the left, from the front, shot and shell poured in upon us. Many a brave man went down, many a horse fell, flinging his rider to the earth. Many a horse without a rider ran wildly out of the ranks, then, terrified at being alone, with no hand to guide him, came pressing in among his old companions, to gallop with them to the charge. Fearful as it was, no one stopped, no one turned back. Every moment the ranks were thinned, but as our comrades fell, we closed in to keep them together, and instead of being shaken or staggered in our pace, our gallop became faster and faster as we neared the cannon, all clouded in white smoke, while the red fire flashed through it. My master, my dear master, was cheering on his comrades with his right hand raised on high, when one of the balls, whizzing close to my head, struck him. I felt him stagger with a shock, though he uttered no cry. I tried to check my speed, but the sword dropped from his right hand. The rein fell loose from his left, and sinking backward from the saddle, he fell to the earth. The other riders swept past us, and by the force of their charge I was driven from the spot where he fell. I wanted to keep my place by his side, not to leave him under that rush of horses' feet, but it was in vain. And now, without a master or a friend, I was alone on that great slaughter ground. Then fear took hold on me, and I trembled as I had never trembled before, and I too, as I had seen other horses do, tried to join in the ranks and gallop with them, but I was beaten off by the swords of the soldiers. Just then another soldier, whose horse had been killed under him, caught at my bridle and mounted me. And with this new master I was again going forward. But our gallant company was cruelly overpowered, and those who remained alive after the fierce fight for the guns came galloping back over the same ground. Some of the horses had been so badly wounded that they could scarcely move for the loss of blood. Other noble creatures were trying on 3 legs to drag themselves along. Others were struggling to rise on their 4 feet when their hind legs had been shattered by shot. Their groans were piteous to hear, and the beseeching look in their eyes as those who escaped passed by and left them to their fate I shall never forget. After the battle, the wounded men were brought in, and the dead were buried. "And what about the wounded horses?" I said. "Were they left to die?" "No, the army farriers went over the field with their pistols and shot all that were ruined. Some that had only slight wounds were brought back and attended to, but the greater part of the noble, willing creatures that went out that morning never came back. In our stables, there was only about 1 in 4 that returned. I never saw my dear master again. I believe he fell dead from the saddle. I never loved any other master so well. I went into many other engagements, but was only once wounded, and then not seriously, and when the war was over, I came back again to England, as sound and strong as when I went out.